Okay, so today we're going to talk about more demand and supply issues, using it for studying two particular generic types of situations in markets. First one is price control. There are many ways in which we try to control prices in a market. I want to discuss what the consequences of that are, so that you can make a decision of whether you want to support these things or not. We'll use the example of rent control, but it occurs pervasively, actually. And the second one is the enormous topic of taxation. We want to talk about how taxes affect markets, and then ultimately who ends up paying for taxes. It's not necessarily as simple as you might think who ends up paying for a tax. And if you have in your mind who you want to pay for it, the analysis we're going to do today is going to show you how you want to place the tax, on what kinds of goods you want to place the tax, to make sure the person you think should be paying the tax will pay it. Okay? So it's very important topics. And the issues in this analysis, as in much of analysis with demand and supply, has to do with the steepness of the demand and supply curves. So I want to go over this just a little bit and get some examples going on it that we'll use then later when we talk about how the things play out with price control and taxes. So let's first look at demand responsiveness. What I've shown here are two different curves. One of them is steeper than the other, okay? And I just want to cement the concepts here. Let's first look at the steeper demand curve. If you raise the price with that steep demand curve, there's going to be a very small drop in the quantity that people consume of the good. It's going to be just a small decrease in how much people buy of the good when you raise the price. What is an example of a good with a steep demand curve? Drugs. We already did that one, right? What else? Gasoline. Other examples? Housing. Housing is a good example. Let me come up with that later. So let's keep that one in mind. Housing is a very steep demand. Everyone has to have a house. Staple foods. I'm going to keep that one in mind. Housing and food, because they're going to come up in an example now when I change it. Now let's look at the less steep demand curve. The same increase in the price causes people to quit buying this good in mass quantities. So a lot of people quit buying it and use their money for something else, okay? What are examples of demand curves that are less steep, that are relatively flat? Segway? Maybe so. I have no idea. Anything else? Well, the two examples that were given for the steep demand curves actually provide information about relatively non-steep demand curves. And this is a very important point. When you look at a category of goods as a whole, like housing, the demand curve can often be relatively steep. But if you look at one component within that category, such as housing in Pleasanton, okay, or one city, okay, the demand curve is going to be less steep because people have to have housing, but they don't have to have it in that particular neighborhood, okay? So if the price rose for housing in general, there would be very little reduction in demand for housing in general. But if the price rose for housing in one city, people would move to other cities instead of living in that city, and reduce the amount of demand for that one city. Okay? Food is another extremely good example. If you raise the price of all food items, there would be very little diminution in the quantity demanded, because we have to eat to live. But if you raise the price of one kind of food, like apples, people would then switch and buy pears and bananas instead, and reduce their consumption of that good. So what this actually tells you, the steepness of the curve, is how many substitutes are there out there for meeting a similar need or a similar desire for the person. And when you define the goods broadly, there's often not much of a substitute. But when you define the goods very narrowly, there's often much more of a substitute. So an example that we're going to come up with later, automobiles. If you raise the price of all automobiles, there probably isn't going to be much reduction in demand because of the fact that we all feel we need a car to get around. Okay, but if you raise the price of foreign automobiles, then there'd be a reduction, quite a large reduction in the demand for foreign, because people would switch to domestic. And this actually becomes relevant when we try to define the optimal tax policy that we want to enact, because sometimes we want to place the tax on all the goods, some of them on a subset of the goods, and it'll depend critically on the relative steepness of the demand curve. Okay? Much more responsive to price. Now, I have used the word responsiveness, and I'm using the word steeper and less steep, because I like things to be very intuitive. I like our language to be as meaningful as possible. There is a technical term for this called elasticity. Your section GSIs will go over the definition of elasticity and how that relates to all this and how to actually measure it. Okay? It is exceedingly important to know that. However, it's even more important to know all of this from an intuitive perspective. It's not that you'll ever have a conversation with someone in the public and say, well, the elasticity of demand is high, and they'll know what you're talking about. But if you talk about consumers being more responsive or less responsive, that's a meaningful concept. So I think it's very important to understand these things without the technical terms and also understand the technical terms. Okay, the same ideas apply for supply. If you raise the price of the good, suppliers will respond by providing more of it because it's now more profitable to provide that good. If the demand curve is steep, supply curve is steep, that means that suppliers will only respond a little bit to the increased price. Okay? And if the supply curve is less steep, then it means that they're going to supply a lot of extra goods when the price increases. Okay, so let's, go back there. What's an example of a steep demand, supply curve? Diamonds. Why? You can't produce diamonds quickly, real diamonds. And it's hard to find the ones that are there. And so if you raise the price, it's not going to really increase the number that are going to be discovered or mined. That's true. That raises another example, land. If you raise the price of property, generally it doesn't increase the supply much because the land's fixed. Wasn't it Mark Twain said they're not making it anymore? Someone else over here? Gold. Yes, because it's hard to mine gold. Okay. What's an example of a less steep? If you raise the price, lots of suppliers will start providing more of it. What? Candy? Yes. Candy is a good example because it's easy to make. Anyone can make it. If you could make a lot of profit out of it, a lot of people would be providing it. So if the price of it went up, more and more people would be, entrepreneurs would be out there providing candy at a price that covers the cost. Essentially, anything that is relatively easy to produce is going to be price sensitive because as the price goes up, the profits associated with it's going to be higher, and more people are going to want to go in and provide that thing. Okay, so you get a relatively flat, not steep supply curve when things are relatively easy to produce. And in fact, you get an extreme, as we'll see later, of a flat supply curve in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so now we're going to use these ideas for two types of intervention. One is price intervention. We're going to use rent control as the example. What I want to show here, kind of as an overview, is the reasons that economists are generally against any form of price control. This is one thing that economists are pretty clear about, that price control actually hurts markets and hurts consumers and producers. It's not a good idea. However, I also want you to realize that there are no absolutes in this field. There's just better understanding, and there can be conditions under which you might think legitimately, knowing everything that could be wrong with price controls, that you still think in certain circumstances they should be there. I'm going to go through the arguments where those might be the case. Okay? So I'm going to start with the standard argument against price control. Okay, so if we have rent control, a market that is a freely operating market, no intervention to prevent price from moving whatever it would do, we would have a demand for housing and a supply for housing. Say this is housing in Berkeley, rental units in Berkeley, and there would be some price that's established within that market. Okay? The problem that many people would see in this situation that would give rise to rent control is that we think that the price is too high, that it's unfairly too high, or it's bad because it hurts low-income people, or whatever. For some reason, we feel that we don't think the price is right. The price is good. However, what I want to show you is that actually the problems that give rise to this high price are exacerbated as soon as you try to place a price control to prevent the price from being that high. Okay, suppose we now instead passed a law that said you can't charge more than a certain amount for rental units, okay? So this is a very stylized form of rent control. Obviously, different cities have different kinds of rent control. In San Francisco, you can't raise the rent after people moved in, but you can raise it after, when a new tenant comes in. In Berkeley, you can't raise it except under circumstances at all, okay? So it's different things. But stylized, you could think of it, we're setting a price that's below what the equilibrium was. What is going to be the impact of this on the quantity transacted? Recall that you always have to have two parties to make a transaction, and so the quantity transacted is actually going to go down. This is the main reason to feel that rent control is actually not a good idea. The problem that generally gives rise to rent control is there's not enough units available for the number of people who want to buy them, and so the price gets astronomical. But what happens as soon as you apply rent control is you make that problem even worse. You reduce the number of units that are available on the market. What happens here is some people who are willing to supply rental units as grandmother units or whatever in their apartments or whatever, at a lower rent, they're just not willing to. It's not profitable, it's not worth the hassle, and they take their units off the market. And so you have actually fewer markets, fewer units available to this mass of people that want to have them. So the basic problem is not enough units, and by putting on this rent control, you make that problem even worse by having fewer units available. Okay? That's the first problem. And that's generally considered by economists to be the main problem, is that it actually exacerbates this underlying situation that gives rise to the need for the price control. However, there are two other things that come about that are problematic in other ways. One is that you necessarily create this excess demand. You've got now more people wanting to buy the units at that rent-controlled price than there are available. And as we know, this is necessarily going to place some kind of pressure on prices to move up. And as long as it's illegal to charge more than this, this form of pressure is going to be played out in illegal ways. It won't necessarily be effective of raising price all the way to its old equilibrium, but there's going to be something going on, and it's generally going to be illegal. Side payments, people renting an apartment at this price and then subletting it at a higher price. All kinds of things can go on that, are arrangements between parties that they both agree to not to tell anyone else about, so that it'll happen. So what you have is this excess demand, and that creates these bizarre types of alternative arrangements that are outside the market. The second problem is one of allocation. Let's go back to without rent control. Here. One of the advantages of a normally operating market system is that it allocates the goods that are sold in a rational fashion among people. What happens here is, this is the equilibrium price. Anyone who is willing to pay more than that price gets a unit, and anyone who's willing to pay less than that price doesn't get a unit. So it's a very simple allocation rule, and it's one that kind of makes sense, in that whoever's willing to pay more, it's worth it more to them, so they should get it. Okay? So anyone who's willing to pay more gets the unit. Anyone who's willing to pay less doesn't get the unit. It's a nice dividing thing. You can think of lining people up of how much they're willing to pay for the unit, and you just stop at the point where you've used up your units, and that is the allocation. It's a very rational allocation rule. And it seems fair, the people who are willing to pay more for that relative to other things. Notice willingness to pay is always you're giving up something else. It's like an opportunity cost of what you could have spent with the money. So the people who are most willing to give up other things for it are the ones who get it. With rent control, however, you don't have that rule going on. With rent control at this price, you've got all of these people that are willing to pay that amount or more, but still aren't necessarily getting the unit. You don't have the people who are most willing to pay necessarily getting the unit. For example, if, say this is $1,000 as the controlled price. One person who gets that unit might be willing to pay $1,010. So they're willing to do it, and they enter the transaction. And another person who doesn't get the unit might be willing to pay $2,000. Well, that on its face looks like an irrational allocation. The person who's willing to pay more should get the unit over the person who isn't willing to pay as much. And secondly, what's even more important about it is, if the person who got it for $1,010 gave it to the person who was willing to pay $2,000, and the person who got $2,000 gave $500 of that to the other person, they'd both be better off. The person who's willing to pay $2,000 is now paying $1,500, $1,000 for the unit, plus $500 for the apartment, to the trade with the person. And the person who's giving it up to this other guy is willing to pay $1,010, but instead is getting $500 in return and not having to pay for the unit. So he's like still finds a unit someplace else, but gets this $500 cash. So they're both better off. So what it means is that side agreements actually can improve everyone's welfare. I just showed you an example of where both parties are helped by making this side agreement. But what does this side agreement do? Essentially, it moves us back up to where we were, if it actually is activated. So either we have mutually advantageous trades being made, which essentially eliminates the role of the price control and moves us back to the original equilibrium, or we have those trades not being made, and the gains that could be obtained from them don't occur. We have that loss that could have occurred that didn't occur. Okay? So that's the problem. There's three problems. One, it reduces quantity, which the lack of quantity was the basic underlying problem to start with. Two, it creates a surplus, an excess demand, which then plays out in various ways. And third, it doesn't allocate the goods in a rational fashion. It allocates them in a way where there's always some way you could make people better off without hurting anyone. So why don't we do that? Okay? Yeah. The person who can't afford to pay is willing to pay $1,000. Right, but that person would be even better off not getting the apartment, but getting $500 in free money from this person who does get the apartment. And then he can go buy an apartment somewhere else for $1,000 plus $500. See that? No. Let's see. If the person's willing to pay $1,000 for the apartment, that means they're not willing to pay $1,500. Okay? And if they rent the unit for $1,000 and don't give it to this other person, they're essentially paying $1,500. They're paying $1,000 for the unit and the $500 they could have gotten from the other person. So they're essentially paying $1,500 in opportunity cost by keeping the apartment. And they're actually, by only being willing to pay $1,000, would be better off having that $1,500 in their pocket rather than the apartment. If they weren't better off, they would have been willing to pay $1,500 for it. That's the idea, that this $500 from the other person becomes part of the cost to the apartment of the person who's living there, because they could have sold it for that extra $500. It's an opportunity cost. Yeah. Yes. And I don't want to deny that. That is definitely true. The price is lower. The people who happen to get them are now getting a benefit. Some people are people who won't be able to afford or couldn't afford this. It's this extra amount of demand out here that is at the lower price. So it's true, these people are now getting apartments that they wouldn't, some of the people are getting apartments that they wouldn't be able to afford or wouldn't choose to afford otherwise. That's true. It's also true that there's an alternative arrangement that could make them even better off than having the apartment. And by having this here, you have either those trades get made, which circumvents this whole process, or they don't get made, in which there's kind of like money on the table sitting there that nobody's getting. So both of those things are true. And I don't want to negate the first one with the second one, but the two go hand in hand. And that actually raises then, okay, so there's three issues that arise with this. This often is used to explain why we don't want to have rent control. However, in a situation like this, where the supply curve is exceedingly steep, the most important problem, the one that I mentioned first, of the reduction in supply, quantity supplied, that reduces the number of units and exacerbates the problem that was causing the high prices to start with, that's relatively small. Okay? So it might be that in this case, you would be willing to, as a social judgment, decide I'm willing to forego this many units altogether to help all these people that can't afford high prices. And I'm also willing to forego the potential extra gain they could get if they made side agreements, or let them make the side agreements and get the extra. Okay? So this is a situation where your judgment on where you want to fall on these things, after you're informed of all the issues that are involved, could be very situational. In situations where the supply curve is very steep, you could perhaps believe that rent control is perhaps a good idea. The equity considerations outweigh whatever problems there are with it otherwise. And when the supply curve is not steep, you'd feel otherwise. Well, so now, where do we have rent control? Berkeley, San Francisco, Manhattan, where else can you think of? All those places have exceedingly steep supply curves. You're not building more land in new units in San Francisco. Hard to get a permit. Berkeley, Manhattan, it's exceedingly difficult. Where do you not have rent control? Phoenix. There's vast wastelands all around Phoenix. If they ever, started to raise prices of housing in Phoenix, you just build another subdivision. And so it's perhaps the case that we are, as a society, actually making semi-rational decisions on how to apply rent control, applying it in the situations where the problems are the least and perhaps outweigh the equity benefits of having low-income people, lower-income people have it. That doesn't mean those problems go away. It's just that they're counterbalanced by these other things. Yeah. That's a good point. His question was, if there's no rent control, will the person who's willing to pay $1,000 and not get the unit just end up with his $1,000 and no unit, or what? And that is the essence of what, if you put on rent control and then allowed everyone to make their side agreements, you would end up back where you started at, but instead of the landlords getting that money, the landlords would get this amount of money, and the people who happened to rent the apartments at this low price and then traded them through those side agreements would get the extra money. So essentially, that example I'm showing is a way of transferring money from landlords to renters, the ones who activate the side agreement. Now, as soon as you see it that way, you can obviously recognize that's an exceedingly poor way to transfer money. If you want to transfer money from landlords to poor people, you should tax landlords and give it to poor people. Because this is not necessarily poor people that are getting these. It could be the rich people that are getting them still. You have no idea who's getting them. You got this excess demand, and there's no mechanism for determining who's going to get the units. In fact, it leads to massive discrimination based on irrelevant factors such as race, gender, employment history, that kind of thing. And so the rent control with the side agreements activated transfers income in a way that is probably not the best way to do it. But if that's all you can do, you can't get through the laws, something else, then perhaps this. Okay, any other things? This is an exceedingly important question because these kinds of controls come up all the time in your life. You have to vote on them. Okay. Now, the other way that we intervene, yes? Does it rent control make the supply curve less steep? Why would changing the price? The question is, would rent control cause the supply curve to be less steep? And the answer is no. Rent control changes the price, but the supply curve tells you at any given price how much people are willing to supply. Okay? So if indeed lowering the price causes a lot of people to not rent out their spare rooms, then the supply curve will be not steep. It'll be like that, But that's something that you ask when you're figuring out what the supply curve is. You say, if the price were at this point, how many people would supply? If the price is at this point, and you get all those answers. And so if what you're saying is true, that reducing the price will cause lots of people to not rent out their spare rooms, then the supply curve is not steep. It's actually like that. But that's not caused by the rent control. That's before you even think about doing rent control. That's just what response to price is in the market.
Well, I was thinking that wouldn't rent control make people change their prices? Does rent control actually
Okay, yes, there is a way in which there's layers on layers. There's anticipation of future prices. Under rent control, without rent control, you might be a developer who decides to build more units because you think the price is going to go up to a new equilibrium that'll be higher than it currently is. With rent control, you wouldn't have that expectation, and so you wouldn't build those. And that would be in case in which the actual putting on of rent control changes the shape of the supply curve, the long-run supply curve. Yes, but how to think about this? I don't want that to confuse the idea, even though what I just said is true, I don't want it to confuse the idea that usually it's most effective to think of demand curve and supply curve as fixed, and then you layer your policy on top of it, rather than it having a feedback. It can, but then you should consider that as a separate step afterwards. That's a good point, though. Okay, so taxing. Another way we affect markets is through taxes. We all care about taxes. It's a big issue. We all think government needs to have money, but we all want someone else to pay for it. And so it'd be useful to know who pays for goods. How many of you remember Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana? Yeah, anyone from the South? I was from Texas. We all know him. He had a great little poem about taxes. Don't tax me, don't tax thee. Let's tax the man behind the tree. I love that. That's exactly what you want. You get a room full of people to decide what taxes are going to be. It always ends up taxing somebody that's not in the room. Okay, so we're going to look at this with excise tax. Suppose there's a 50-cent per gallon tax put on gas. And this is practically what the gas tax is, about half of the total price. Without any tax, let's say the price for gas is $1. I'm doing this just to keep the numbers simple so we don't have nomenclature issues here. There's a demand curve and a supply curve, and there's a certain quantity that's transacted. What we want to figure out is what is the impact of placing an excise tax on gasoline. Okay? An excise tax now is a tax per unit. So it's a certain amount, like 10 cents per unit, 50 cents per gallon, whatever. It differs from a sales tax. A sales tax is a percent of the price. Our sales tax is like 8%, 8.5% of the sales price. This tax, an excise tax, does not depend on the price. It's a certain amount per quantity sold. And so it makes it easier for us to examine. In section, you're going to talk about sales taxes, and then from those two examples, you can go to most any kind of tax you want. Okay. So how would we represent the imposition of a tax on this market? I propose and hope to convince you of the fact that you can represent a 50 cents excise tax as an upward shift in the supply curve equal to 50 cents. So you just take the curve and shift it up. Okay? Now, why is that? This is the key element, understanding why it is that that a tax represents an upward shift in the supply curve, as I've described it. The key element here is that the price is the price paid by consumers. This is what I'm describing today. So mark on your page, this is the price paid by consumers. Now, let's just look at a particular price. Let's say we're right here, at that price here. We're not there, but we're asking, what would people supply at that price? Okay? And this is the amount that's supplied at the price without a tax, if there's no tax. Okay? Now we add 50-cent tax. What that means is we have to charge consumers 50 cents extra for suppliers to get exactly the same amount of money as they were before. So this point right here, which is what suppliers were willing to pay to supply without the tax, now with the tax, 50 cents higher, they're still willing to pay exactly that, supply exactly that amount. Because at this price, the consumer pays the price, the government takes 50 cents, and the supplier gets this price down here, which is where they were to start with. Okay? So all that means is that when this is the price paid by consumers, and the government takes 50 cents out of that price before it goes to suppliers, whatever the supplier was willing to supply before is exactly the same as what they're willing to supply now at a 50-cent higher tax price, because the government takes that extra 50 cents. That's why it's an upward shift. Yeah?
Why would the supplier incorporate 50% tax instead of just keeping the price the same and slapping on the 50 cents?
That's a good question, and in fact, we're going to answer that. The question is, why would the supplier incorporate the price instead of other ways? And in fact, he or she won't. But notice again, this is the same question as here. The crucial thing is to think about what the supply curves are and demand curves are before you look at their interaction. And what a supply curve is asking the question, if the price were what here, how much would suppliers supply? And now the question is, if the price is here and the government takes 50 cents of that price, how much are suppliers willing to supply? It's there. That's not necessarily what suppliers will what the price will end up being, but it's the answer to that hypothetical question. If the price paid by consumers was this, and the government took 50 cents, suppliers would supply that amount. Okay. Then we have to work through the whole rigmarole of what the interaction is. Okay, as soon as you recognize what the impact of a tax is on the demand and supply curves, it's relatively simple to see what the change in equilibrium is going to be. And importantly, in most cases, an increase of putting a tax on the good of a certain amount increases the price by less than that amount. In the example I've drawn, the distance here is 50 cents, and yet the new equilibrium is only 20 cents higher. Okay? Now, how does this come about? Again, you don't want to just jump from one equilibrium to another. You always want to be able to look at the process. You can think of it in two different ways. What was your name? Jason. Two different ways that this could occur with the suppliers. Either the price could stay exactly as it was, and then the government take 50 cents out of it. Okay? What that means is suppliers are now getting 50 cents less, and they're willing to supply less of the good. And so now there is excess demand. Demand exceeds supply, and there's excess demand, and that bids up the price until you move to the new equilibrium. The other way you could see it is suppliers immediately slap the 50 cents on top of their price, and we move to here. And now, because the price is 50 cents higher, consumers don't want to buy as much, and you've got a excess supply of the good, and the price bids down. Whichever way it goes is irrelevant. It ends up at the same point, okay, where the new quantity demanded is equal to the new quantity supplied at that price when the price is price paid by consumers. This is an important lesson. I don't know how many times I've read in the newspaper reports of there's going to be a tax on blank, and so the price is going to rise by that amount. It's just not true. The amount the price rises depends on the interaction of demand and supply, which depends on the steepness of each of those. And we're going to get into that in a second. Okay, so we got a 50-cent tax. Okay, the government's taking 50 cents out of every gallon that's consumed, but the price only rose 20 cents. What that means is actually producers are having to pay the other, that 20 cents is what consumers pay. Producers pay the other. At this new equilibrium, this is the price paid by consumers. The government takes 50 cents, which puts producers at this point getting 70 cents. $1.20 minus 50 cents is 70 cents. The wedge between these two is what the government gets. This is what consumers pay. This is what suppliers receive. And so the amount that consumers pay has gone up 20 cents. They pay 20 cents. The amount suppliers receive has gone down 30 cents. So that means in any taxation situation with normally shaped upward sloping demand and, down, crisscross demand and supply curves, you have both parties paying part of the tax. The consumer tax burden is the area from the original price up to the new price, and the supplier's tax burden is from the original price down to the new price minus the tax, which is down here. So they both share in the burden. This is interesting. People don't think about this. You think about putting tax on goods. Usually you think, oh, well, let's put tax on gas and screw the oil companies. It's actually both parties that are going to have to pay it. And in fact, we can tell who's going to pay the majority of it simply by the steepness of the various curves. And this is where it becomes important for understanding if you want someone to pay the tax, you got to place it on the right kind of good to make that happen. So let's look at the demand curve. Here we've got a very steep demand curve, and what happens here is the consumer pays most of the tax. The producer has an extremely small portion of the tax burden. Okay? So if you want consumers to pay a lot of the tax, you want to place the goods, tax on goods with steep demand curves. So let's go back to our examples. What are goods with steep demand curves? Drugs. Well, we don't do drugs, tax drugs. Cigarettes, though, what's interesting here is taxes on cigarettes are practically entirely borne by the people who smoke cigarettes. So this idea that you're taxing cigarettes so as to hurt the tobacco companies, it ain't happening. All the states in the union made an agreement with the tobacco companies that they would pay a certain amount to the states in return to help pay for future health care costs. That was seen as a landmark where the government was forcing the cigarette companies to give up money and hand it over to the state. It's done on a per pack basis. And so what actually it is an indirect form of excise tax, which means cigarette smokers are paying for this, not the tax companies. And this is an example of Huey Long. You had the states and the cigarette companies in a room and set up a procedure where someone not in the room paid the tax. So now you might think people who smoke deserve to pay the tax because they shouldn't be smoking in the first place. I actually think smokers are so beleaguered anyway. I don't smoke, not to say that, but they're going to have to deal with the health consequences. Why do they have to pay for it also? Anyway, you can make your decisions on this. If you have a very not steep demand curve, then mostly producers pay the burden and consumers don't have to pay very much. Okay? So this, again, helps in deciding how you want to place taxes. Let me go back to the steep one again. For cars, for example, remember I was talking about cars? If you place a tax on all cars, like a registration tax, then that is going to be borne mostly by consumers. It doesn't really hurt producers much. But if you put a tax on imports, then it will mainly be borne by the companies who are importing the cars, by foreign producers. So if you want the producers of a good, a subset of producers to pay for the tax, then it's good to put it on a subset of the goods, and then those producers will have to pay for it. Because you want to find something where consumers have an ability to switch to something else to avoid the tax, if you want consumers not to pay it. If you want consumers to pay it, you put it on something that they really can't get out of too easily. Similarly, on the supply side, if you have steep supply curves, such that increasing the price of the good has very little effect on the amount supplied, then producers end up paying most of the burden and consumers pay very little. And the opposite, when you have not steep supply curves, okay, there consumers pay most of the tax. What is the underlying principle? I've got a final slide there with a lot of words on it, but I think what's most interesting is to think about what is actually happening here. Who ends up paying the tax? In a word, it's the people who cannot respond. If suppliers cannot respond to a price by changing their supply, so they have a steep supply curve, then they end up paying most of the tax. If consumers can't respond by changing the quantity that they buy in response to the higher price, then they pay most of the burden. So essentially, the way to think about this is it's the person that's most constrained the party that has the fewer options who ends up paying the tax. This might be unfair. It's kind of like the people who already have few options, you're making their life even worse off. But that's the way it works. And that's a succinct way to think about who's going to end up paying the tax. It's the party that's less able to respond is going to end up paying the tax. Okay, any questions on this? Nope. Okay, see you Monday. Thank you.